Hello again. Welcome to the next session of us reading The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien. I'm at home again this week, as I'm sure most of you guys are. I've got a fun little wall hanging in the back. I don't know if you can see it, but it says, "When in doubt, go to the library," which is a quote from Harry Potter talking about Hermione, how whenever she needs to know something, she always goes to the library. So that's one of my favorite quotes, and since this is kind of our library time, I thought it would be fun. So last time we were together, we read part of chapter 5 of The Hobbit, which was Riddles in the Dark. We met Gollum. We talked about how Gollum got the ring and how Bilbo kind of found it, and then they did their little riddle thing. And if you guys remember at the very end, Bilbo discovers that he has what Gollum wants, which is the ring, which makes him invisible, which if you've seen Lord of the Rings, it's the Ring of Power. So what I'm going to do this time is I'm going to just read like I did last time, a half an hour. We'll probably end up in chapter 6 somewhere, but chapter 6 is another long one. So I'm going to go back to the last about paragraph so we can kind of catch up. But first, I actually wanted to show you something. I said that I would show this to you guys the last time and I forgot, but here is my copy of the Silmarillion. It's actually one that my dad gave me. He bought it in the 70s when it came out. But if you guys remember, we saw this picture when Thorne and the company were first on the mountain before they got into the Goblin Cave and even before Bilbo fell. So let me see if I can find it really quick. Oh, here it is. So see, that's the same drawing as my copy of the Silmarillion. Very cool. I actually haven't read the Silmarillion. I heard it's a bit difficult to read, just because it's a lot of made up history and mythology, and it's not like a clear story, kind of like The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings. But if you're ever interested, that is available. J.R.R. Tolkien and his son Christopher, who unfortunately passed away just actually a few months ago, were both huge in the world of fantasy. If you guys didn't know this, if anybody's a Dungeons and Dragons fans like my family is, the monsters from Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit are actually the basis for all the monsters in Lord of the Rings. Gary Gygax was a huge fan of Tolkien. So if you ever see like a halfling is a hobbit, just like it is in Lord of the Rings. And if you see the trolls, they're big and they're monstrous like there are in Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, not like trolls that were small kind of in mythology. So if you ever want to look into that, that's something interesting. I'll see if I can find some fun links maybe to post. So let's get on with our story. So I'm going to start about a paragraph back. So, "Curse it, curse it, curse it," hissed Gollum. "Curse the Baggins. It's gone. What has it got in its pockets? Oh, we guess, my precious. He's found it and he must have it. My birthday present." Now at this point, Gollum's guessed that Bilbo has his ring, but Bilbo's actually already put it on and he's invisible, and Gollum's chasing after him and he can't see him, and Bilbo's kind of figuring out that this ring is kind of more than just a little trinket. Bilbo pricked up his ears. He was at last beginning to guess himself. He hurried a little, getting close as he dared behind Gollum, who was still going quickly, but not looking back, not turning his head from side to side, as Bilbo could see from the faint glimmers on the wall. "My birthday present! Curse it! How we lose it, my precious! Yes, that's it. We came this way last, when we twisted that nasty young squeaker. That's it. Curse it! It slipped from us after all these ages and ages. It's gone, Gollum." Suddenly Gollum sat down and began to weep, a whistling and gurgling sound, horrible to listen to. Bilbo halted and flattened himself against the tunnel wall. After a while, Gollum stopped weeping and began to talk. He seemed to be having an argument with himself. "It's no good going back to where we searched. No, we doesn't remember all the places we visited, and it's no use. The Bagginses has got it in its pocketses. Nasty noser has found it, we say. We guesses, precious, only guesses. We don't know till we find the nasty creature and squeezes it. But it doesn't know what the present can do, does it? It'll just keep it in its pocketses. It doesn't know, and it can't go far. It's lost itself, the nasty nosy thing. It doesn't know the way out. It said so. It said so, yes, but it's tricksy, and it doesn't say what it means. It won't say what it's got in its pockets is. I know. I know the way in, and I know the way out, yes. It's off to the back door. To the back door, that is. The goblins will catch us, but they won't get that, but it can't get out that way, precious. Goblins is. Yes, but if it's got the present, our precious present, then the goblin won't be able to get it, Gollum. They'll find it. They'll find out what it does. We shan't ever be safe again. Never, Gollum. One of the goblins will put it on, and then no one will see him. He'll be there, but not be seen. Not even our clever eyes will notice him, and he'll come creepsy and tricksy and catch us. Gollum, Gollum. Then let's stop talking, precious, and make haste. If Baggins has gone that way, we must go quickly and see. Go, not far now, make haste. With a spring, Gollum got up and started off, shambling off in a great pace. Bilbo hurried after him, and still cautiously, though his chief fear now was tripping on another snag and falling with a noise. His head was in a whirl of hope and wonder. It seemed that the ring was a magic ring. It made you invisible. He had heard of such things, of course, in old tales, but it was hard to believe that he had really found one by accident. Still, there it was, Gollum with his bright eyes passing him by, only 1 yard to the side. On they went, Gollum flip-flapping ahead, hissing and cursing, Bilbo behind, going as softly as a hobbit can. Soon they came to a place where, as Bilbo had noticed on the way down, side passages opened this way and that. Gollum began to count them. 1 left, yes. 1 right, yes. 2 rights, yes, yes. 2 lefts, yes, yes, and so on. As the count grew he slowed down. He began to get shaky and weepy, for he was leaving the water further and further behind, and he was getting afraid. Goblins might be out, and he had lost his ring. At last he stopped by a low opening on their left and went up. 7 right, yes. 6 left, yes, he whispered. That's it. That's the way to the back door. Yes, there's the passage. He peered in and shrank back. But we darest go in, precious. No, we darest. Goblinses are down there. Lots of goblinses. We smell them. Sss. What shall we do? Curse them and crush them. We must wait here, precious. Wait a bit and see. So they came to a dead stop. Gollum had brought Bilbo to the way out, after all, but Bilbo could not get in. There was Gollum, sitting humped to the right of the opening. His eyes gleamed cold in his head, as he swayed from side to side between his knees. Bilbo crept from the wall more quietly than a mouse. But Gollum stiffened at once, and sniffed, and his eyes went green. He now hissed softly but menacingly. He could not see the hobbit, but he was on alert, and he had other senses that the darkness had sharpened, hearing and smell. He seemed to be crouched right there, with his flat hands splayed on the floor, his head thrust down, and his nose almost to the stone. Though he was only a black shadow in the gleam of his own eyes, Bilbo could see or feel that he was tense as a bowstring, gathered to spring. Bilbo almost stopped breathing and went stiff himself. He was desperate. He must get away out of this horrible darkness while he had any strength left. He must fight. He must stab the foul thing, put out his eyes, and kill him. It meant to kill him. No, that was not a fair fight. He was invisible now. Gollum had no sword, and Gollum had not actually threatened to kill him, or had tried to yet, and he was miserable, alone and lost. A sudden understanding of pity mixed with horror welled up in Bilbo's heart. A glimpse of endless unmarked days without light or hope of betterment. Hard stone, cold fish, sneaking and whispering. All of these thoughts passed in a flash of a second. He trembled, and then quite suddenly in another flash, as if lifted by a new strength and resolve, he leaped. No great leap for a man, but a leap in the dark. Straight over Gollum's head he jumped, 7 feet forward and 3 in the air. Indeed, he had known it, and only just missed cracking his skull on the large arch of the passageway. Gollum threw himself backwards and grabbed at the hobbit as the hobbit flew over him, but too late. His hand snapped in thin air, and Bilbo, falling fair on his sturdy feet, sped off in the new tunnel. He did not turn to see what was Gollum doing, and there was a hissing and cursing almost at his heels at first. Then it stopped. All at once there came a blood-curdling shriek, filled with hatred and despair. Gollum was defeated. He dared not go any further. He had lost. He lost his prey, and lost, too, the only thing he had ever cared for, his precious. The cry brought Bilbo's heart to his mouth, but still he held on. Now faint as an echo, but menacing, the voice came from behind. Thief! 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 Baggins! We hates it! We hates it! We hates it forever! Then there was a silence, but that too seemed menacing to Bilbo. If the goblins are near, that must have smelt them, he thought. But now he'll have heard the shrieking and cursing. Careful now, or they will lead you to worse things. The passage was low, roughly made. It was not too difficult for the hobbit, except in the spite of all of his care. He stubbed his poor toes again, several times, on nasty jagged stones on the floor. A bit low for goblins, but at least big ones, thought Bilbo, not knowing that even the big ones, the orcs of the mountains, go along at great speeds, stooping low with their hands almost on the ground. Soon the passage had been sloping down, began to go up again, and after a while it climbed steeply. That slowed Bilbo down, but at last the slope stopped, and the passage turned a corner and dipped down again, and there, at the bottom of the short incline, he saw, filtered round another corner, a glimpse of light. Not a red light as a fire or lantern, but pale out-of-doors sort of light. Bilbo began to run. Scuttling as fast as his legs could carry him, he turned the last corner and came suddenly right to an open space, where the light, after some time in the dark, seemed dazzlingly bright, where it was only a leak of sunshine in the doorway, where a great door, a stone door, was left standing open. Bilbo blinked, and then suddenly he saw the goblins in full armor with drawn swords sitting just inside the door, and watching it with wide eyes and watching the passage that led to it. They were aroused, alert, ready for anything. They saw him sooner than that. Yes, they saw him. Whether it was an accident or a trick of the ring before it took his new master, it was not on his finger. With yells of delight, the goblins rushed upon him. A pang of fear and loss, like an echo of Gollum's misery, smote Bilbo, and forgetting to even draw his sword, he struck his hands into his pockets, and there was the ring still in his left pocket, and it slipped on his finger. The goblins stopped short. They could not see him. He had vanished. They yelled twice as loud as they did before, but not so delightfully. "Where is it?" they cried. "Back up the passage," someone shouted. "This way," some yelled. "That way," others yelled. "Look out for the door," bellowed the captain. Whistles blew, armors clashed, swords rattled, goblins cursed and swore and ran hither and thither, falling over one another, getting very angry. There was a terrible outcry to do and disturbance. Bilbo was dreadfully frightened, but he had the sense to understand what had happened, and to sneak behind a big barrel, which had held drink for the goblin guards, and so to get out of the way to avoid being bumped into, trampled to death, or caught by Feel. "I must get to the door, I must get to the door," he kept on saying to himself, but it was a long time before he ventured to try. It was like the horrible game of blind man's bluff. The place was full of goblins running about, and the poor little hobbit dodged his way this and that, was knocked over by a goblin who could not make out what he bumped into, scrambled again on all fours, slipped between the legs of captains just in time, got up and ran for the door. It was still ajar, but a goblin had pushed into it. Bilbo struggled, but he could not move it. He tried to squeeze through the crack. He squeezed and squeezed, and he stuck. It was awful. His buttons had got wedged on the edge of the door and the doorpost. He could see out into the open air. There were few steps running between the narrow valley and the tall mountains, and the sun came up from behind a cloud and shone bright on the outside of the door. But he could not get through. Suddenly one of the goblins shouted, "There's a shadow by the door! Something is outside!" Bilbo's heart jumped into his mouth. He gave a terrific squirm. Buttons burst off in all directions. He was through with a torn coat and waistcoat, leaping down the steps like a goat, while bewildered goblins were still picking up his nice brass buttons on the doorstep. Of course, they soon came down after him, hooting and hallooing and hunting among the trees, but they didn't like the sun. It makes their legs wobble and their heads giddy. They could not find Bilbo with the ring on, slipping in and out of the shadows of the trees, running quickly and quietly, keeping out of the sun. Soon they went back grumbling and cursing to the guard at the door. Bilbo had escaped. All right, now we are on to chapter 6, which is called Out of the Frying Pan into the Fire. If you don't know, that is a saying. It's kind of like, you're in a hot situation, but now you've jumped out of the frying pan and into the fire. You're not out of danger yet. You've just gone from one bad situation to another one, which is, unfortunately, that's kind of foreshadowing what's to come. Bilbo is out of the goblins area, but now he's jumped into the fire. Bilbo had escaped the goblins, but he did not know where he was. He had lost his hood, his cloak, food, pony, the buttons on his coat, and now his friends. He wandered on till the sun began to sink westward, behind the mountains. Their shadows fell across Bilbo's path, and he looked back. Then he looked forward and could see before him only ridges and slopes. Slopes falling towards lowlands, and plains glimpsed occasionally between the trees. "Good heavens!" he exclaimed. "I seem to have gotten right to the other side of the Misty Mountains, right to the edge of the land beyond. Where, oh where can Gandalf and the dwarves have gone to? I only hope to goodness they are not still back there in the power of the goblins." He wandered on and out of the little high valley, over its edge, and down the slopes beyond. But all the while, a very uncomfortable thought was growing inside of him. He wondered whether he ought now that he had the magic ring, to go back into the horrible, horrible tunnels and look for his friends. He must have just made up his mind that it was his duty, and that he must turn back, and very miserably felt about that, when he heard voices. He stopped and listened. It did not sound like goblins, so he crept forward. He was on a stony path winding downwards with a rocky wall to his left hand, and the other side of ground sloped away. There were dells below, the level of the path overhung with bushes and low trees. In one of these dells, under a bush, people were talking. He crept nearer, and suddenly peering between two big boulders, a head with a red hood on it. It was Balin, doing the lookout. He could have clapped for joy, but he did not. He still had the ring on, and for fear of meeting something unexpected and unpleasant, and he saw that Balin was looking straight at him without noticing. "I will give them all a surprise," he thought, as he crawled towards the bushes at the end of the dell. Gandalf was arguing with the dwarves. They were discussing all that had happened to them in the tunnels, and wondering and debating what they were to do now. The dwarves were grumbling, and Gandalf was saying that they could not possibly go on with their journey with leaving Mr. Baggins in the hand of the goblins, and without trying to find him if he were alive or dead, or without trying to rescue him. "After all, he is my friend," said the wizard, "and not a bad little chap. I feel responsible for him. I wish to goodness you had not lost him." The dwarves wanted to know why he had ever been brought along, why he could not stick with his friends and come along with them, and why the wizard had not chosen somebody with far more sense. "He has been more trouble than you so far," said one. "If we go back there and look in those abominable tunnels for him, then drat I say it." Gandalf answered angrily, "I brought him, and I don't bring things that are of no use. Either you help me look for him, or I can go leave you, where you can get out of this mess as best as you can yourselves. If we can just find him, you will thank me before this is all over. Whatever did you want to go drop him for, Dory?" "You would have dropped him," said Dory, "if a goblin had suddenly grabbed your legs from behind in the dark and tripped up your feet and kicked you in the back." "Then why didn't you pick him up again?" "Good heavens, can you ask? Goblins fighting and biting in the dark, everyone falling over bodies and hitting one another. You nearly chopped off my head with Glamdring, and thorns stabbed here and there everywhere with Orcrist. All of you suddenly gave up your blind flashes, and saw the goblins running back yelping. You shouted, 'Follow me, everybody!' And everybody ought to have followed. We thought everybody had. There was no time to count, as you quite well know, until we had dashed through the gate guards and out of the lower door, all helter-skelter down here. And here we are, without a burglar. Confuscate him." "And here's the burglar," said Bilbo, stepping into the middle and slipping off the ring. Bless me, how they jumped! And they shouted with surprise and delight. Gandalf was as astonished as any of them, but probably more pleased than the others. He called to Balin and told him that he thought of a lookout man. He thought of a lookout man who let people right into them without any warning. This is the fact Bilbo's reputation went up a very great deal from the dwarves after this. If they had still doubted that he was really a first-class burglar in spite of Gandalf's words, they doubted it no longer. Balin was most puzzled of all, but everyone said it was a very clever bit of work. Indeed, Bilbo was so pleased with their praise that he just chuckled inside and said nothing whatever about the ring. And when they went and asked him how he did it, he said, "Oh, I just crept along very carefully, very quietly." "Well, this is the first time that even a mouse has crept along carefully and quietly under my nose and had not been spotted," said Balin. "I'll take my hood off to you," which he did. "Balin, at your service." "At your servant, Mr. Baggins," said Bilbo. Then they wanted to know all about his adventures after they had lost him, and sat down and told him everything, except about finding the ring. Not now, he thought. They were particularly interested in the riddle competition and shuddered most appreciative at the description of Gollum. "And then I couldn't think of any question with him sitting behind me," ended Bilbo, "so I said, 'What's in my pocket?' And he couldn't guess in 3 guesses, so I said, well, what about your promise? Show me the way out. And he came at me to kill me, and I ran and fell over, and he missed me in the dark. And then I followed him because I heard him talking to himself. He thought I really knew the way out, so he was making for it. And then he sat down at the entrance, and I could not get by. So I jumped over him, escaped, and ran down the gate. But what about the guards? Weren't there any? Oh, yes, lots of them. But I dodged them, and I stuck in the door, which was only open a crack, and I lost a lot of buttons, he said sadly, looking down at his torn coat. But I squeezed through them all right, and here I am. The dwarves looked at him with quite a new respect when he talked about dodging the guards, jumping over Gollum, and squeezing through as if it was not very difficult or alarming. What did I tell you? Said Gandalf, laughing. Mr. Baggins has more about him than you guess. He gave Bilbo a queer look under his bushy eyebrows, as if to say this hobbit had wondered if he had guessed the part of his tale that he had left out. Then he had questions of his own to ask, for Gandalf had not explained it all by the dwarves now. Bilbo had not heard it. He wanted to know how the wizard had turned up again, and where they had all gone to now. The wizard, to tell you the truth, never minded explaining his cleverness more than once. So now he told Bilbo that both... excuse me. It's allergy season. So he told Bilbo that both he and Elrond had been well aware of the presence of evil goblins in that part of the mountain, but their main gate used to come by was on a different path, one more easily to travel by, and so they had often caught people benighted near their gates. Evidently, people had given up going that way, and the goblins must have opened a new entrance at the top of the pass the dwarves had taken quite recently, because it had been found quite safe up until now. I must see if I can find a more or less decent giant to block it up again, said Gandalf, or soon there will be no getting over the mountains at all. As soon as Gandalf had heard Bilbo's yell, he realized what had happened. In a flash, which had killed the goblins that were grabbing him, he had nipped inside the crack, just as it had snapped too. He followed after the drivers and the prisoners right to the edge of the great hall, and there he sat and worked up the best magic he could in the shadows. A very ticklish business it was, he said, touch and go. But of course, Gandalf had made a special study of bewitchments of the fire and lights. Even the Hobbit had never forgotten the magic fireworks at Old Took's midsummer parties, as you remember. And the rest we all know, except that Gandalf knew where the back door and the goblins had called the lower gate, where Bilbo had lost his buttons. As a matter of fact, it was well known to anyone who was acquainted with this part of the mountain. But it took a wizard to keep his head in the tunnels and guide them in the right directions. They made the gates ages ago, he said, partly for a way to escape if they needed one, partly as a way out into the lands beyond, where they could still come in the dark and do great damage. They guard it always, and no one has ever managed to block it all up. They will guard it, no doubtedly, after this, he laughed. All the others laughed too. After all, they had lost a great deal, but they had killed the great goblin and many others besides, and they had escaped. So it might be said to have the best of it so far. But the wizard called them to their senses. We must be getting on at once now that we are a little rested, he said, for they will be out after us in hundreds when the night comes. Already their shadows are lengthening. They can smell our footsteps for hours and hours after we've passed. We must be miles before dusk. There will be a bit of a moon if it keeps fine, and this is lucky. Not that they mind the moon much, but it will give us a little light to steer by. Oh, yes, he said in answer to more questions from the Hobbit. You lose track of time inside goblin tunnels. Today's Thursday, and it was Monday night or Tuesday morning that we were captured. We have gone miles and miles and come down through the heart of the mountain, and are now on the other side, quite a shortcut. But we are not to the point in which our pass would have brought us. We are too far to the north, and have some awkward country ahead. We are still pretty high up. Let's get on. I'm dreadfully hungry, groaned Bilbo, who was suddenly aware that he had not had a meal since the night before last. Just to think of that for a hobbit. His stomach felt all empty and loose, and his legs were wobbly now that the excitement was over. Can't help it, said Gandalf, unless you'd like to go back to the goblins and nicely ask to have your pony back with your luggage. No, thank you, said Bilbo. Well, then, we must tighten our belts and trudge on, or be made into supper. That would be much worse than having none of our own. As they went on, Bilbo looked from side to side for something to eat, but the blackberries were still only in flower, and of course there were no nuts, not even hawthorn berries. He nibbled a bit of sorrel, and drank from a small mountain stream that crossed his path, and ate 3 wild strawberries that he found on the bank. It was not much good. Still they went on. The rough path disappeared. The bushes and the long grasses between the boulders, and the patches of rabbit-cropped turf, the thyme and the sage and the marjoram, and the yellow rock roses had all vanished, and they found themselves on top of a wide, steep slope of fallen stones, the remains of a landslide. When they began to go down, this rubbish and small pebbles rolled away from their feet. Soon larger bits of split stone went clattering down and startled other pieces below them, slithering and rolling. Then lumps of rock were disturbed and bounded off, crashing down with a dust and a noise. Before long, the whole slope above them and below had seemed on the move, and they were sliding away, huddled all together in fearful confusion of slipping, rattling, clacking slabs and stones. It was the trees at the bottom that saved them. They slid into the edge of the climbing wood of the pines, and here they stood right at the edge of the mountain slope from the deeper, darker forests of the valleys below. Some caught hold of the trunks and swung themselves into lower branches. Some, like the little Hobbit, got behind a tree to shelter himself from the onslaught of rocks. Soon the danger was over, and the slide had stopped, and the last faint crashes would be heard as the largest of the disturbed stones went bounding and spinning among the bracken and the pine roots far below. "Well, that has gotten us on a bit," said Gandalf, "and even the goblin tracking us will have a job coming down here quietly." "I dare say," grumbled Bomber, "but they won't find it difficult to send stones bouncing on our heads." The dwarves and Bilbo were feeling far from happy, and they were rubbing their bruised, damaged feet and legs. "Nonsense! We are going to turn aside of the path of the slide. We must be quick. Look at that light." The sun had long gone behind the mountains. Already the shadows were deepening about them, though far away through the trees and over the black tops of these growing lower downs, they could see that the evening light on the plains below. They limped along now as fast as they were able down the gentle slopes of a pine forest, in a slanting path leading steadily southward. At times they were pushing through the sea of bracken and tall fronds rising above the Hobbit's head. At times they were marching along as quiet over a floor of pine needles. All the while, the forest gloom got heavier and the forest silence deeper. There was no wind that evening to bring even a sea sighing into the branches of the tree. "Must we go any further?" said Bilbo, when it was so dark he could only see Thorin's beard wagging beside him, and so quiet that he could hear the dwarves breathing like a loud noise. "My toes are all bruised and bent, and my legs ache, and my stomach is wagging like an empty sack." "A bit further," said Gandalf. After what seemed ages further, they came suddenly to an opening where no trees grew. The moon was up, and it was shining into the clearing. Somehow it struck all of them as a nice place, although there was nothing to see. All of a sudden they heard a howl away down the hill, a long, shuddering howl. It was answered by another away to the right, and a great deal nearer to them. Then by another not so far away to the left. It was the wolves howling at the moon, wolves gathering together. There were no wolves living near Mr. Baggins' hole at the time that he knew of the noise. It had been described to him often enough in tales. One of his elder cousins on the Took side, who had been a great traveler, used to imitate it to frighten him. To hear it out in the forest under the moon was too much for Bilbo. Even magic rings are not much use against wolves, especially the evil packs that lived under the shadow of the goblin-infested mountains, over the edge of the wild, on the borders into the unknown. Wolves that sort smell keener than goblins, and do not need to see you to catch you. "What shall we do? What shall we do?" he cried. "Escaping goblins only to be caught by wolves," he said, and it became a proverb, though now we say "out of the frying pan into the fire," in the same sort of uncomfortable situation. So there you see. He's like, well, great, now I escaped the goblins, and now I'm just going to get eaten by wolves. Great. "Up the trees quick," said Gandalf, and they ran to the branches at the edge of the glade, hunting for those that had branches fairly low or were slender enough to swarm upon. They found them as quickly as ever as they could. You can guess. Up they went, as high as they could trust the branches. You would have laughed from a safe distance if you had seen the dwarves sitting up in the tree, with their beards dangling down like old gentlemen, gone cracked and playing at being boys. Feely and Keely were at the top of a large larch tree, like an enormous Christmas tree. Dori, Nori, Ori, Oin, and Gloin were more comfortable in the huge pine, with the regular branches sticking out at all intervals like the spokes of a wheel. Bifur, Bomber, and Bofer, and Thorin were in another. Dwalin and Balin had swarmed up a tall, slender fir with few branches and were trying to find a place to sit in the greenery on the topmost boughs. Gandalf, who was a good deal taller than the others, had found a tree into which they could not climb, a large pine standing at the very edge of the glade. He was quite hidden among the boughs, but as you can see, his eyes gleamed in the moon as he peeped out. And Bilbo, he could not get to any tree. He was scuttling about from trunk to trunk like a rabbit who had lost its hole and had a dog after it. "You've left the burglar behind again," Nori said to Dory, looking down. "I can't always be carrying burglars on my back, down tunnels and up trees. What do you think I am, the porter?" "He'll be eaten if we don't do something," said Thorin, for there were howls now all around them, getting nearer and nearer. "Dory," he called, for Dory was lowest up the easiest tree, "be quick and give Mr. Baggins a hand up." Dory was really a decent fellow in spite of his grumblings. Poor Bilbo could not reach his hand even down to climb. He could not even reach his hand when he climbed down to the bottom branch and hung his arms down as far as he ever could. So Dory actually climbed out of the tree and let Bilbo scramble up and stand on his back. All right, so we're just about, we're actually a little less than halfway through chapter 6, but I'm going to stop there since we've gotten to about 30 minutes. And I know that's right before something exciting is going to happen, but you'll just have to wait on bated breath. Will Thorin and Bilbo and everybody get eaten by wolves now that they've escaped the goblins, or will they make it all the way to the Lonely Mountain? Only time will tell. So, did you guys like this? I really like this part. I think this part is very exciting. The first few chapters are kind of leading up, but after you get to Riddles in the Dark, it feels like there's so much more adventure going on than on all the chapters before. So, I'm going to stop there. We will pick back up on Wednesday. I hope that you guys had a great weekend. I miss seeing you guys after this break. We're already 4 weeks into our remote learning, and it feels like it's been forever since we've seen you. Mrs. Whited and I miss you guys so much. I hope us reading this has been a lot of fun. It's been a lot of fun for me, but it does bum me out that I can't be there to read it with you guys, because I really do like seeing all your reactions to things. So I hope you have a fantastic week so far, and I will see you on Wednesday. Bye, everyone.